and welcome to the Central Nebraska Virtual Property Tax Town Hall. I'm Jim Vocal, Chief Executive Officer of the Platt Institute, and I'll be your host this evening. I'm joined by Laura Ebke and Sarah Curry from my team, and we're happy that everyone's here tonight. Our team at the Platt Institute focuses on removing barriers to growth and opportunity in Nebraska. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works with Nebraskans from all different points of view to advance policies that help Nebraskans keep more of what they earn, make it easier to start and grow a business, and to build a talented workforce in our state. The local property tax burden in Nebraska imposes a barrier in each of these areas. But in recent years, the Nebraska legislature has struggled to build a consensus that would help rein in taxes on our homes, our farms, and businesses. That's where today's town hall comes in. The ball may be in your court as a voter and taxpayer to build support for property tax reform through a future ballot initiative. That means Nebraskans would have to work together to decide what approach would improve the tax system and generate widespread support. Throughout tonight's town hall, the floor is yours. This is an interactive event where you can discuss how property taxes impact you and to share your thoughts on a way to make things better. We'll also discuss the various ideas that have been proposed for property tax reform. You can join the discussion through the chat window or through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen here on Zoom. If you'd like a moment to speak on our camera or over audio to share your thoughts, please just include that request with your Q&A submission, and a member of our team will get in touch with you by chat. Then I'll call on you when it's time for you to join the discussion. We'll also be running live polls on property tax issues throughout tonight's town hall. Let me show you how it will work by kicking off tonight's first poll question. When we start a new poll, a question will appear on your screen. Just select the answer and click submit to have your vote counted in the poll. So let's start with tonight's first question. Let's get a sense of how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted your priorities. With everything that has happened during the COVID-19 pandemic in Nebraska, are you more concerned about property taxes, less concerned, or about as concerned as before? Now you can make your selection on your screen now. Number 1 for more concerned, 2 for less concerned, and 3 about as concerned as before. And while we wait for everyone to cast their vote, Sarah, our policy director at the Platt Institute, can you tell us a bit about what's going on with property tax in Lincoln in the coming weeks?
Sure, and thanks, Jim. Well, we've got a lot going on right now in Lincoln. The legislature just came back in today and they had a full day worth of debate. And let me tell you, property taxes were one of the topics that they were talking about. Maybe not in the bills they were discussing, but offhand, we had some bills that were filed today or amendments to bills filed that were supposed to address property tax. And we still have this as a forefront at the discussion in the legislature. Lawmakers are talking to news reporters. There were multiple tweets coming out today from lawmakers and reporters on property tax. So a lot's happening. The big property tax bill that everyone's been hearing about, the LB 1106 coming out of the Revenue Committee, is scheduled to be heard on Wednesday. So we look forward to hearing that debate and seeing what happens from that. Otherwise, there's other tax bills that are coming out, and all of those are aimed at affecting property tax in one way or the other. Some are aimed at increasing the revenue to go towards property tax, and then some other ones targeting businesses trying to add to their relief. So just a lot going on right now.
Thanks, Sarah. And the voting is now closed on tonight's first live poll, and here are the results. So once again, the question is, with everything that has happened during COVID-19 pandemic in Nebraska, are you more concerned, less concerned, or about as concerned before with property taxes? And it's an even split right now, 50-50. 50% are more concerned, 50% are about as concerned before, with nobody answering less concerned. We're going to close that poll. Laura Ebke, you are a former state senator and a former school board member, and you'll be providing some color commentary this evening as you did last week as well. This is the second audience of Nebraskans we've posed this poll question to this summer. Any thoughts on the response compared to last week or overall?
Yeah, I think last week the numbers were a little greater for more concerned, but I don't think there was anybody that was less concerned. I think that what this really points to is that property taxes are just a huge issue for much of the state. Certainly in the more rural areas of the state, it's a tremendous concern. And I think that our legislators are going to be hard pressed not to deal with something. There's certainly going to be the pressure put on them to deal with it. But COVID has done crazy things for all of us. It's created a level of uncertainty, and property taxes are one of those things that death and taxes. It's one of those things that's always certain that we know that we're going to see, and people are getting kind of nervous, I think, about how they're going to pay their property taxes this fall, their second half.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Laura, I think your assessment's pretty accurate. Now that we've given one poll a try, let's bring on our first speaker this evening from Central Nebraska. We've got Barbara from Hastings here. Barbara, you wanted to discuss how property valuations in Adams County are impacting you. Thanks for joining us tonight on the virtual town hall to share your thoughts. The floor is yours. Barbara, you're there.
I have been a long time, yeah, I am. I've been a long time landlord, and since like the mid 90s is when I've gotten most of my properties. And I've had two of them raised over 258% during that time. One of them raised 2.186%, or 286%. One raised 171%. Plus my own property's been raised about, not as much, but my rental properties have definitely been raised over the years. I had 7 properties. I have 5 now. But I'm just concerned, you can't make a living when they keep raising property taxes like this.
Absolutely. Thanks, Barbara. And I think what we've seen all across the state, and especially in your region in Western Nebraska, valuation increases have increased substantially over the last decade. And political subdivisions of all levels are receiving a windfall because they're not decreasing the rate, and that's making it harder for you as a taxpayer. So thank you for sharing that. Do you have anything else you'd like to share, Barbara?
No, not that I can think of.
Okay, thank you. Sarah and Laura, as Barbara points out, there's been a lot of concern about rising property valuation in recent years in Central Nebraska. There have been a lot of formal protests from taxpayers who are experiencing the sticker shock of double and triple digit % increases in valuations. What are some of the things that the legislature has tried to do to protect Nebraskans when valuations rise? Sarah, do you want to take that first?
Sure. Well, a year ago, the legislature passed LB 103, which what that does is it makes these city and county boards and school districts hold a public hearing when they want to increase your property taxes. So before, they would just increase your property taxes, and you had to be an engaged citizen and go out of your way to hear the debate and make your voice heard. Now with LB 103, they actually have to hold a special session or meeting, and that way you can go and you can voice your concerns, and they have to actually vote that they are collecting more money. So we all know they can lower the levy, but the valuations go up. So they're taking more of our money from us. And so what LB 103 does is gives a little bit more transparency to that entire process.
Laura, anything to add?
Yeah, you point to a really important thing here that even in an era when you have to have more budget hearings, even when you have to have override votes or in order to increase the rate, we still have a real problem with the assessed values, and the way that we assess the values is based on market value. And when you have a finite amount of land and a finite amount of and then there's a demand, people will spend more on land or on whatever property than they might have otherwise. That raises the rates. And so we've seen this around the state. Farmers, especially big landowners, have complained that land that's been in their family for 75 or 100 years, that they're paying more in taxes than their grandfather paid for it back in 1950 or whatever, even with the adjusted with income adjusted. So, I think that this is one of the problems that we've got, and when I was on the school board in Crete, we started reaping the benefits, the windfalls, if you will, of those assessed values. But what we also did was we lowered our property tax ask. So we could say that we had decreased taxes, but in reality, people were still paying more because they were paying a lesser percent on more more valuations. I mean, it is a difficult, people can say they cut taxes when they really didn't cut taxes in real dollars for citizens.
Sarah, as far as LB 1106, the property tax bill, are there any valuation limitations in that bill that will be debated on Wednesday?
Yes, there are actually. For the agricultural land, we're going to see, if this bill is enacted, we'll see a reduction over the next 3 years. So in 2020, agricultural land will go from 75% to 65, and then it'll go to 60 to 55% of actual value in 2022. So it kind of progressively gets there. So it's not just one big hit at one time. And the same thing for residential property. It will, residential, commercial, and industrial, it will reduce it for a range. So it starts from 87 to 95%, and then it'll go 83 to 91, and then it'll end up in 2022 and after 79 to 87%. And while that's still a relatively high figure, it's much lower than the 100% level that we're at today. So if 1106 does pass, I think we will definitely see some property tax relief. And the way they're doing that is, it's a bit complicated, but essentially the state funds a portion of public education. And so the state's going to pick up that lost amount. So the reduction in property tax, on the flip side, the state will then give more money to the school districts to hold the districts whole.
Thanks, Sarah. So that's where the senators are right now. Laura, tell us why it's been such a long road in the legislature in trying to pass property tax reform over the last few years.
Well, certainly part of the problem is the changing demographics of the state. The rural-urban divide is something that we should never underestimate. While folks in urban areas do pay property taxes, obviously, it's not quite the same for them as it is for those who are paying property taxes on large segments of land. Beyond that, you have school funding and how we fund our schools. A good chunk of our property taxes go to funding our schools. I think something like 60% in many instances fund the, of your property tax dollars go to your schools. And the school funding formula, the state has to make sure that the schools are funded, but the school funding formula with the additional TIOSA dollars really kind of leaves the interests in the big cities in doubt, when you start talking about big property tax reform. And so everybody is left with this unknown, and nobody really trusts anybody else to look out for the interests of their constituents. And so sometimes you have Republicans and Democrats and everybody else arguing over what's best for their constituency, and they don't necessarily fall in line to fix the property taxes. And then the other thing is just structural. The legislature, by its very nature, is tough to get things done in if it's at all controversial. 49 members, theoretically it only takes 25, but we know that it takes 33 because you have to break the filibuster in order to move on to a vote. And so finding 33 votes is kind of tough. It's a lot easier to find 17 to say no to something than it is to find those 33 to say yes.
Yeah, Laura, to your point, it only takes 17 senators out of 49, and we don't even get to the opportunity to vote in the legislature on some of these tough things. Sarah, that was great analysis on 1106. Part of that bill also does include some spending limitations on schools. Is that correct? I believe it's 2% now with the current amendment.
Yes, I believe that's correct. Well, the driver for property taxes really is school spending, because if governments don't spend money, then there's no reason to tax us, right? So the money has to go somewhere. So as schools spend more money, the property tax must increase. Now you're going to say we have to fully fund our schools. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, but we do need to be responsible and considerate of the taxpayers when we look at that. And so that's why 1106 does have some spending restraints there, because if we don't restrain it on the backside, there's no safeguard, if you will, to keep the property taxes from just exponentially keep going up.
Yep, spending is certainly the driver of taxes in the state. So thank you for that. And legislation is only one way the property tax issue can be approached, but another way is through a voter initiative, which we're here tonight to get feedback from each of you about. There are two ways initiatives can get on the ballot in Nebraska. The first is that a state senator can introduce a resolution for a ballot measure. But in order for an issue to get in front of voters that way, the legislature would have to approve giving Nebraskans the chance to vote on either a law or a constitutional amendment. That's not likely to happen with property tax reform because the legislature has struggled to even pass its own legislation. So the second way an issue gets on the ballot is through a petition drive that is authorized by the Nebraska Secretary of State. Laura, as a former legislator, do you want to offer any insight on how petition drives generally work?
Sure. Well, the petition drives are have become increasingly popular. The big problem we've got with petition drives, it's tough to do a citizen-driven one without having money, because the number of signatures that you need are incredible. It's based on the number of registered voters in the state. In order to put up a constitutional amendment on the ballot, you have to get 10% of the total registered voters, which is something like 1.2 million people right now. And you don't actually know what that 10% is until you actually turn the signatures in. And so you have to make sure you leave yourself plenty of wiggle room. So if you have to go out and collect 100, let's say 130,000 signatures, that's a lot of signatures in the state, especially when they have to be scattered between different counties. It'd be easier, I guess, if you could camp out in Lincoln and Omaha and just collect signatures there, but you have to go out in other in other parts of the county where there aren't all that many voters. So it is it's complicated. Many of the successful petition drives in recent years have had a significant amount of funding, and they've been able to pay people to go out and hang out at the local community festivals and fairs and things like that and collect signatures so that they can turn enough in. But it does seem to be increasingly, if they can get funded, it seems to be increasingly the way to go to get real change made in some of these issues, because the legislature doesn't seem to want to take it on.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's right. Oh, sorry. Well, I was going to say, Nebraska is a really special place because when we talk about ballot measures, just between 1996 and 2018, there's been 73 different ballot measures in Nebraska. So if you take that out by general election, that's an average of 6 measures per election. So it's actually a lot more frequently done here in Nebraska than it is in other states. So that's why we have that citizen legislature, like what Laura was talking about. So it's not, and it's interesting, the property tax situation that we're in right now is the result of a ballot initiative that was driven by the public. So Nebraska has a history of this, and I wouldn't be surprised if in the next couple of years we see another push for that.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate that. One of the positives clearly for ballot initiative is that voters can bypass the legislature, as Sarah just said, and the governor if they feel the leaders aren't giving enough consideration to their priorities. Well, what are some of the downsides and why aren't we voting on a property tax initiative this year? Now, we talked a little bit about that already, Laura, with the constraints of having money behind the campaign, the constraints of collecting signatures in the COVID pandemic landscape. Sarah or Laura, I'll start with you. What are some of the other downsides on why we're not seeing a property tax initiative this year?
Well, I mean, I think certainly COVID is a big part of it. I've heard about this all over the country when, as different groups are trying to collect signatures, that it's not a good environment for, big groups where you can collect a lot of signatures at a time. I think the other piece is that there was some hope that the legislature would actually act, and so there were certain groups that were kind of holding back, hoping that the legislature would actually act and that they weren't going to, and so they were slow getting started, and then COVID came along, and I think that complicated things for them.
Sarah, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think it's very, very difficult in this type of landscape to get paid volunteers to walk. I say paid volunteers, paying people to go out and collect signatures. And so it's just a big uphill challenge, right? The situation that we had in the 60s when we passed the original property tax ballot initiative and changed our constitution was just a different landscape. And so I think the strategies are going to have to change than what they've used in the past.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that property taxes is so complicated. It's tied to education funding and trying to develop a policy that's going to get the support of a lot of different people across the state. So usually we're going to have to give something else up to get property tax reform. And I just don't think that we've had that consensus that has been supported by the general public going forward with a well-funded campaign. So let's go through and talk about some of the ideas that people have brought forward for previous ballot initiatives. And by the way, if you have an idea for a property tax ballot initiative, you can share it in the Q&A section. You're welcome to chime in on camera or on audio if you'd like to join our discussion this evening. One of the issues we've discussed at the Platt Institute is eliminating the sales tax exemptions, or eliminating sales tax exemptions, I should say, in order to achieve property tax reform. But we have some reason to believe that it can be a challenge to accomplish through a voter initiative. Laura, Sarah, do you want to weigh in on that perspective?
Well, there is a provision or a plan that's being put out there that's a consumption tax. So you get rid of all the other taxes out there and you just have a consumption tax, which is essentially a sales tax. No other state has it exactly that way, but a state that's really close to that is Tennessee. They have the highest sales tax in the nation. They have some of the lowest property taxes, and they have no income tax or anything else. So the model has sort of been executed. Tennessee's a high growth state. There's a lot of people that live there, a lot of businesses going there. I think Laura actually used to live there, so she can maybe give a little more insight to that, but it's not unheard of. It is very different. No one else in the Midwest operates that way. So it would be a departure from normalcy for this part of the country.
Yeah, for sure. We moved to Tennessee, gosh, 30 years ago now. 30 years ago, almost this month, we moved to Tennessee, and we were shocked at how, at the size of our sales taxes. We paid a lot in sales tax, but we also, when we registered our car, it only cost us $25 to get the plate. You paid that $25 every year. You didn't pay any personal property taxes on that. And then you also had, you also found that you got all your money back, in your paycheck, from the state. You didn't have, we'd come from Nebraska, and we were in Tennessee for 3 years, and we didn't have any sales tax. And what you find is a lot of people who, we were with the military, a lot of people will, declare their residence to be Tennessee for the rest of their military time, so that they can take advantage of that tax break.
Yeah, and I think Sarah, only tax 3 out of 8 services right now in Nebraska, and so you're going to ask people to pay on services previously exempt from tax, and that's a mindset that is sometimes hard to overcome.
That is, it's really telling when we look at the data from COVID. So we know back in April, everything was shut down. And so we look at the state tax revenues and we see what was hit and what wasn't. And so in Nebraska, surprisingly, our sales tax revenue wasn't that different than it is normally. And that's thanks to internet sales. But a big part of that's what Jim just said, right? You get your hair done, you get your nails done, you get a massage, you get your car worked on, you get your lawn done. Any number of services in Nebraska are not taxed. Now, look at a state like South Dakota that taxes almost everything with sales tax. They're also like Tennessee. And the fact that sales tax is a big piece of their state tax structure, and their sales tax took a huge hit during COVID because a large percentage of their revenue is made up of services. And so it's very, very telling that Nebraska doesn't tax that. And so when they're closed, we didn't miss that revenue as much. And I definitely think it sort of gives this political science experiment, if you will, on how we should move forward with property taxes and just taxes in general.
I think though one of the concerns with all of this, one of the reasons why people are very slow to embrace the notion of expanding, our sales tax base, is that they want to see where their other taxes are actually going to be cut. And I mean, that's kind of, we've got a history of, well, we're going to cut this tax and that'll help you, we're going to raise this tax a little, we're going to cut other ones, but we never actually do away with them. And if you don't actually do away with the tax, it's hard to make the case to folks that, this is a long-term solution. Instead, what happens is, we start that upward trajectory again in the other taxes. And so, it's not unreasonable for people to be nervous about it. It's not unreasonable for businesses to be a little nervous about it, even though it is good policy.
And that brings up another point. A lot of times we hear this, this phrase, the three-legged stool. And what that means is property tax, sales tax, and income tax. Well, we just talked about South Dakota and we talked about Tennessee. So I would like to talk about the pogo stick illustration. How are they doing? They've got one major tax and those states are growing and they're doing very well. North Carolina, they're cutting. I think they're using this COVID as an opportunity to completely eliminate their corporate income tax. So you can operate on a ladder or a pogo stick. It doesn't have to be a three-legged stool. And so I don't think we necessarily have to even all of that stuff out. Every tax has its benefits and its drawbacks, and we have to figure out what is right for Nebraska moving forward. And property tax is just not one of them.
Thanks, Sarah. So there are senators in the legislature who want to kind of supercharge the idea of expanding the sales tax by moving to what they call a consumption tax, which Sarah described, which is meant to sweeten the deal by proposing to get rid of most taxes in Nebraska other than the sales tax. What is it? What is that? And why are some people trying to float it as a ballot initiative idea? Laura, Sarah, anything else you want to offer on the consumption tax?
Well, we've talked about it already a little bit. If people are interested in finding out sort of more about the concept of it, look up the fair tax. That was a big thing, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. A lot of people were talking about it, maybe even before that. The idea behind that at a national level, many states now are kind of embracing that. State legislators and others are embracing that as something that should be instituted here in their states to replace those taxes.
I was sitting in a revenue hearing last year, and I was sitting next to a gentleman that owned a gas station. And for those of you that don't know, one of the bills was to tax pop and bottled water and candy and those types of things. And he said, well, I don't want them to tax that because that's going to, make my business go down and people aren't going to buy it. It's going to make it harder. And I said, well, why are they only taxing that? Isn't going to make it harder to say this is a bottle of water, but this is juice and one should be taxed and one shouldn't? Shouldn't it just be applied to everything? And when I told it to him just that plainly, he went, well, that's right. Like, if you're going to tax it, just tax everything. Why would you pick and choose? Why would you make my life more difficult having to pick which one to do the compliance and the tax recording on and everything? So I think that's the benefit of the consumption tax. It's just on everything. You don't have to say it's on this and not on this. Next time you go to the grocery store, look at your receipt. Okay. I've got young children, so I buy diapers and lots of wipes. So when I look at my receipt, I buy oranges and bananas. That's all tax-free. But when I buy my diapers and my wipes, there's tax applied to that. And so, especially at Sam's Club, it'll have a little T right next to what you buy on the receipt. And it's so interesting to see what is taxed and what isn't, because watermelon juice is taxed and orange juice isn't. I still haven't figured that one out, and I work in tax policy. So I know it's confusing to everybody else, and that's why the consumption tax is just so attractive. Just make it simple.
You can make a case too, I think, and I'm not necessarily a proponent of the consumption tax, but you can make the case, and this is the case they've often made, is that it's a tax that you get to choose. That those who are making the purchases decide whether they're going to pay the tax or not. They don't have to. They don't have to. They aren't penalized for making income, or they aren't. You decide whether or not you're going to go buy something and pay the taxes on it. So philosophically, I guess that's one of the cases to be made, perhaps for the consumption tax. On the other hand, it does hurt when you go. We bought a new car when we were in Tennessee. Which was essentially, we paid something like 10% sales tax on it that 30 years ago, and that was that was a bite when you when you had to finance that. So,
thank you both for those thoughts. So I think it's time to do another poll. Now that we've talked about the consumption idea, we're going to see what you, the public, think about it. and let's put up the poll question. How would you vote on a constitutional amendment to end local property and state income taxes, replacing them with a 10.25 sales tax on all new consumer goods and services you purchase? Let us know if you support, oppose, or if you're undecided. Go ahead and take that off the screen. Laura, Sarah, people don't like property taxes. Of course, we've got the 8th highest rates in the country. Has any other state tried or succeeded in getting rid of the property tax altogether? I think I know the answer to this, but I'll turn it over to you, Sarah.
So it's very, very interesting. There's been discussion about it, but the only state that has come very, very close is North Dakota. North Dakota has a proposal. There was actually just an article in a North Dakota news station, I think 2 months ago, of lawmakers saying that this is going to be the biggest driver for new businesses to the state because we're not going to have property tax and we're going to be the only state without it. So it's very interesting that they, out of the entire nation, are the ones pushing for it. I can tell you that New England loves their property taxes, and they were probably not going to get rid of it since they are the ones. It's interesting too. New England has high property taxes, and then it's Nebraska. So we're in the same category as New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. Who would have thought?
Laura, anything further?
No, I mean, I think that you run into one of those problems that states tax what they've got and what their resources are. You know, Nebraska's got a lot of land and we've got property. We don't have the mineral the mineral rights and things like that some states are able to take advantage of. So we have to try to figure out how to pay for everything. And there are limited resources or avenues for revenue.
Thanks. Thank you very much. All right. Gotta find my notes here. All right, the results are in. Here's what people are thinking about the consumption tax idea. 75% support, 13% oppose, and 13% are undecided. So that's pretty strong in support of eliminating the property tax in favor of consumption tax. So that's one way certainly to attack the problem. Laura, let's talk in more detail about a different proposed amendment. The governor had put forward in the legislature a resolution to allow voters to weigh in on a 3% annual cap on property tax valuation growth. That is, if your city collects $100 in property taxes this year, they can only collect 103 property taxes next year. Any other revenue would have to come from another source. It didn't move forward last year. What are the positives and negatives in your view?
Well, a lot depends on what happens with the, if you're up against the levy lid, and you can't, in terms of assessments and things like that, if you're up against a levy lid and you can't assess more, if you are in a high growth area where you've got a high needs area, for instance, I was on a school board that was growing significantly. It would have been tough for us, when you consider that the average, that the negotiated agreements with our staff was typically at around 3.5% every year. For most of the time that I was on the school board, it would be tough to hold it, hold it that tight. Now, citizens, if they're involved and they, make their voices heard, I'm convinced that the local school boards will hear them most of the time and find ways to economize. But that's going to be tough when you've got people coming in and saying, okay, let's add this sport and let's build a new school and let's have smaller class sizes and that sort of thing. So I mean, it's an appealing idea, and it would force a certain level of austerity on local local governing bodies, but it's not without some drawbacks as well.
Sarah, anything to add?
Yeah, I remember being in the legislature and listening to that debate, and it sounds good, right? That you cap your property taxes by 3%. But what happens is you've got fast growing areas like in Sarpy County, and you've got a lot of people moving in. And so they need water, they need sewer, they need electric, they need all these things. And I don't think any of us are saying that they shouldn't have electricity or they shouldn't have water, but that's going to cause your budget to grow by more than 3%. And so there were just a lot of little situations like that where just a constitutional amendment was just too broad and it was too, I guess, encompassing, and there had to be a lot of exceptions in there. And so it was really interesting to hear. I'm not saying that I support, huge growth every year by any means. I would like to see it be a negative 3% every year, but we have to be realistic. And there are people moving to Nebraska or moving around, and they do have those needs. And if we talk about core government services, I think we can all agree that water and public safety are some of those things we're okay the property tax paying for.
Before we get to our next poll question on this idea that we just described, I want to thank Janine for her comment in the chat this evening. She and her husband bought a new home for their retirement. It now costs them $5,000 a year to pay their property taxes, and doesn't believe that she can live in Nebraska anymore because of those high property taxes. Janine, that's what we hear all across the state, and that's why we're all trying to work for a solution to try to make it easier for you to live here. So we've heard a lot about property evaluations from taxpayers. So let's see how this approach that we just talked about, the 3% annual cap, fares in our next poll. How would you vote on a constitutional amendment limiting the annual increase in local property tax revenue to 3%, with the exception that local voters could hold an election to override the cap? Would you support, oppose, or are you undecided? Now, Sarah, you just talked about how you testified last year in the legislature on this issue. Any other reactions that you want to share from the Capitol?
Just the fact that I do think that a constitutional amendment is something that people want. It's very, very difficult, but Iowa has something similar to this, where it has a statewide cap on how much the property taxes can grow. And they initiated that years ago. And now we see Iowa has like property taxes that are a third lower than Nebraska's. And this is also scary. California has lower property taxes than Nebraska. And that's because back in the 70s, they passed a constitutional amendment. Now, there are pros and cons to both of those. We see issues with the California model, but at the same time, there is a constitutional safeguard and provision on property taxes. And to my knowledge, Nebraska doesn't have anything like that, other than the state cannot levy a property tax, and it's only levied at the local level. So I do think a constitutional amendment is something people want, but I don't know what it should be because there's so many pros and cons in our situation.
Thanks, Sarah. Now let's take a look at the poll results now from that question. Once again, the question is, how would you vote on a constitutional amendment limiting the annual increase in property tax revenue to 3%, with the exception that local voters could hold an election to override the cap? 29% would support, 29% oppose, and 43% are undecided. We've talked now a couple ways to change the law so that property taxes are either more limited or are replaced with other kinds of taxes. But there are plenty of Nebraskans who think for tax reform to be meaningful, it has to reduce the size of government through cutting spending. Sarah and Laura, your thoughts on cutting spending to fund property tax relief?
So I'm going to throw out this really fun statistic because I'm a data nerd. And so I went through and I pulled all the local governments in Nebraska. So I'm talking libraries, cemetery districts, school districts, cities, counties, all of them. When you total it up, the debt outstanding is more than the state's general fund budget. So we're talking $4.5 billion of outstanding debt. Now we've got a lot of tiny taxing subdivisions in Nebraska. And when you're small and you don't have that economies of scale, it costs more to levy debt, if that makes sense, because you have all the costs associated with debt, like closing costs when you buy a house. So we talk about this tax burden that we have, and you're right, local governments in Nebraska spend a lot more than local governments in other states. But I think the debt component has to come into it. And surprisingly, you know, I've been doing this for almost 5 years now here in Nebraska, and I haven't really heard any debate at the legislature on debt levels and the cost that that has to our local governments. So I think that that's something that probably needs to come into the discussion, but really like what we're spending money on. I think we need to go back to the fundamentals, and that's where the citizens are right. What are the core functions of government? You know, I take my kids to the playground. I love our city park, but I would gladly donate some of my money to upkeep that park. I don't think that the people that don't have children that never go need to have their tax dollars go to support it. And that's just a very simple user fee model to support some of these things that only specific citizens in the community use. So that's just an example, but really those core government services and defining what those are and what people want. And some people are going to be upset about it. But I think if we all want lower taxes, we have to agree that some things need to go off the government rolls. And I'll let Laura elaborate on that.
Well, I mean, I think you're for sure right that we have to define what those core government functions are. I think the problem is that we're going to have a hard time coming up with what those are. I mean, you talk about user fees and things like that. Well, my kids are all grown up. You know, I don't use the parks ever. You know, I've got a son who's a senior in high school. You know, he's not going to be going to school anymore. You know, the question is, at what point do you stop? Do you say, I'm not getting anything out of this. I shouldn't pay for it. And so, you know, and so if I take my granddaughter to the park when she's visiting, you know, one weekend out of 2 months or whatever, do I then have to pay a user fee? I mean, it becomes complicated. And when you start talking about user fees for things that are typically considered public goods, you know, certainly one of the things that we've talked about a lot in the last year that I've been, you know, year or so that I've been with Platt is, you know, swimming pools. We've talked a lot about swimming pools and communities deciding to add swimming pools and whether or not there's enough value added for that. And you know, that's a debate that each community has to have when they decide to raise their debt load, you know, through a bond issue or whatever. And you know, we can argue whether or not, you know, a new swimming pool in, pick a small town, Friend, is valuable or not, but it's valuable to somebody. And you know, they think that they think that it's an important thing for them to have. Whether they can ever make money out of it, you know, make money from it, or even break even is always the question. And government really isn't a business, unfortunately, right?
Yeah,
Well, and I think, oh, go ahead, Jim, sorry.
I'll go back to that question or the discussion we had about the filibuster and 17 senators. It's really hard to find 33 senators, at least on the statewide level, to agree on spending cuts to fund tax reform. Go ahead, Sarah.
No, you took the words out of my mouth. You're exactly right. Trying to get those senators to agree on that very point, and Laura talked about how difficult it is. You know, I think that's why this property tax issue just hasn't gone away, because it's so hard to quantify. It's not easy. If it was easy, it would have been fixed already.
And on a school level, which sometimes makes up 60% of your property tax bill, we're seeing what the school lobby is doing to 1106 that has the 2% spending controls in it. So I can't imagine what the pressure is on a local level. We certainly see it on the eastern end of the state. So let's pull a hard question right now. We've asked voters this question before, but it's always interesting to see what's on people's mind as circumstances change. In order to reduce local property taxes, would you be willing to reduce government spending, even if it resulted in cuts to services, including public education, local health programs, or road maintenance? Do you support, oppose, or are you undecided? We asked the same question in Western Nebraska last week, and actually we're interested in how results might differ from region to region and district to district. This is an intentionally difficult question we are asking tonight. Sarah and Laura, I think you will agree, cutting enough spending to make a big dent in property taxes is so much easier said than done. Any further commentary than on this issue about cutting spending?
Well, sure. I mean, you know, it's easy well, relatively easy for us as individuals to look at our budget. If we want to cut spending, we can figure out where it works, and you don't have that economy of scale if we have to cut our spending to match up with our income. That said, when you're talking about a society, a community, whatever, it's a lot tougher to get buy-in. You know, you can't do it around a kitchen table with a family meeting and say, we got to tighten our belt here, because somebody's going to be upset, you know, about which belt you're tightening.
Yeah, and you know, I think one thing that we could probably do at the local level that's not being done right now is look at performance-based budgeting. And so what this is where you look at a program and you say, what is the anticipated output of this program? And I'm not talking about we spent this much money and then we spent this much money. Like community college, for example, how many kids are graduating and getting jobs? how many kids are going on to four-year universities. That's an outcome that we can measure, and then you can look at the resources going into it. And so I think if we start doing that at the local level and really evaluating what the purpose is of all these programs, we might find areas to cut spending and be more efficient with our dollars.
Thanks, Sarah. Let's take a look at those poll results now. All right, 50% of you say you would support cutting services to fund property tax relief, 25% oppose, and 25% are undecided. Very interesting. All right, now we're going to move on to questions and comments from our Q&A section. And if you have any questions or comments you'd like to make, now is the time to do so. I want to point to Danny's question about the homestead exemption, or are we looking at the homestead exemption as the credit to help deal with property tax reform? Sarah, do you want to touch that one?
So the homestead exemption in Nebraska is typically only given to the elderly, those in the most vulnerable. In other states, the homestead exemption is much larger and it goes to everybody. And so there's kind of two ways to look at property tax. We can erode it from the base by giving an exemption, let's say the homestead exemption. And so we could just beef up that exemption and start giving it to everybody until it eventually kind of goes away. Or you can go the other way and limit spending and cap it at the top. That being said, we're not advocating to get rid of the homestead exemption by any means. Elderly people like my grandmother, she's 83, she's still kicking, but she needs a little help now and then. She needs that. She needs that little bit of a break because she's on a fixed income and she's a widow. And I know there's a lot of other people in Nebraska just in that same position. So we would never advocate to get rid of something that's targeted at those types of people. That said, if we can have some sort of overwhelmingly huge, big property tax relief program to where it lowers it for everybody, then we don't need those types of exemptions because then it's not a burden on people. And I think that's ultimately where we would like to get to. It's just figuring out that plan and getting the buy-in to get to that point. I hope that makes sense, Danny.
All right, you can ask our team questions about property taxes through the Q&A section or through the chat window. I don't see any at this point, but we're going to be watching it here in the closing minutes of the program. We've had a great discussion tonight, and once again, if I see some questions come in the Q&A chat, I will ask them or address them. But before we go, I want to check with those in attendance this evening to see how our conversation has shaped your perspective about what ought to happen in Nebraska in the years ahead. So let's put up poll question number 5. Here's our final poll question of the evening. Now that you've heard about some of the issues and potential ideas for property tax reform in Nebraska, who do you believe would do a better job of adopting changes to Nebraska's property tax laws? Would it be the Nebraska voters, the Nebraska legislature, or are you undecided on this question? Give it a couple of seconds here.
Laura, how many seconds did you have to vote in the legislature?
Yeah.
How many what?
How many seconds did you have to vote in the legislature?
We had a minute, I think.
You guys are better than that. That's why we're asking you to do it faster.
That's right.
All right, let's take a look at those poll results. 43% say the Nebraska voters would do a better job of adopting changes to the property tax laws. 29% the Nebraska legislature, and 29% are undecided. Sarah, there's a question or a request in the chat section from NTV. Is there anything you want the viewers at NTV in the Central Nebraska Grand Island region to take away from this, and what would it be?
I think that our poll questions are really what should be taken away from this. We had the talk about consumption tax, and then we had to talk about government spending, and we had 50% of the people here say that they support a reduction in government spending. So that tells me, even though we like the things that we have in our communities, people have realized the property tax is so burdensome, they're willing to do without. And then right here, you can see that the Nebraska voters have a better understanding and they would do a better job at adopting changes than even the legislature, which is a citizen legislature. So I think the takeaways here are that people are fed up. They've got high property taxes. We saw from one lady where she might actually have to leave the state because her property taxes are so burdensome. And so I think all taxes get to a point when you reach that tipping point where, they change people's behavior. We saw that in New York. The income taxes got so high that people started moving to Connecticut and New Jersey, and it's happening in Nebraska. People are jumping the river and going to Iowa or going to Colorado or, going to South Dakota. And so I think that's the main takeaway, is that this scenario with the pandemic and everything going on has really illustrated just how burdensome the property tax is for Nebraskans.
I think if I might, Sarah, I think raises a really good point. People are fed up. And they are truly fed up on property taxes. Sarah and I co-authored a piece that was posted on our website this morning on the Louisville School District bond issue, where they, the citizens said, as I put it, they hashtag just said no to more property taxes and higher property taxes. And I think that the legislature and others would be well advised to consider that people truly are upset about property taxes. They're also telling them, no more. And this Louisville issue is an issue where the school district was increasing in size. There was a higher enrollment. The school board and the administration did everything that successful bond issues do in terms of multiple town hall meetings and lots of advertising and lots of discussions, and the citizens said no. So I think that is a harbinger of things to come, and we ought to be paying attention to it.
Yeah, and I think my takeaway is that property tax reform is pretty tough, and past legislatures and past sessions we haven't seen it get done. We'll see what the next 2 weeks brings as the legislature finishes up this session, and if there is a path forward for 1106, but it may take the support of the general public in pushing a ballot initiative to provide some relief from these very burdensome property taxes that we pay moving forward. So I want to thank everyone this evening for joining us and helping to make this virtual event possible, especially with all the difficulties these last few months have brought. I'd be grateful for your feedback as the Platt Institute continues its work to remove barriers for Nebraskans. You can find the recording of this event soon and connect with me and my team anytime at plattinstitute.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and LinkedIn. Everyone in Central Nebraska, have a great evening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.